One of my favourite games of all time is Might and Magic 6: The Mandate of Heaven. As a kid I spent countless hours playing it. I explored every nook and cranny, completed every quest and built up my party from a bunch of weaklings to devil slaying masters. I don't think I played any other game but it for at least a month or two. Between Might and Magic 6 and Daggerfall, I was completely enamoured by the RPG genre. Today however, even with the overwhelming indie developer presence that now exists, to my surprise there are still very few games that take the Might and Magic formula and put it into practice. Sure, there are plenty of dungeon crawlers to be found and that is great, but they are very different from the style of Might and Magic. Last year however, I happened to come across a game that did make use of the M&M formula, and I made sure to keep it on my radar. And while it has taken me what feels like an eternity to get around to it, I finally got a chance to cover it. Legends of Amberland: The Forgotten Crown is an old school turn-based RPG that takes inspiration from the classic games of the 90s, including Might and Magic and Wizardry series. It is developed and published by indie developer Silver Lemur Games, previously known for Stellar Monarch and Automobile Tycoon. It released on Steam August 1st, 2019 for PC and is priced at €16.79. On April 20th, 2020, Legends of Amberland received a release on the Nintendo Switch. Legends of Amberland successfully presents a classic and addictive turn-based RPG experience that fans of such classic titles will enjoy. However, veterans looking for depth with gameplay and story will feel somewhat disappointed by its basic plot and simple mechanics. In Legends of Amberland, you take on a role of a party of 7 adventurers who have been called upon by an old friend who happens to be the wizard of the Royal Castle of Amberland. The wizard tells you that he has found through reading royal annuals that there exists a crown that belongs to the royal family. Nobody has ever heard of this crown or knows of its existence. The wizard believes a spell of forgetfulness has been cast upon the lands of Amberland, forcing everyone's failure to recall the crown. But such a spell can only be cast by a very powerful sorcerer. It is your quest to figure out who is responsible for the spell and to remove it. Only then will you be able to find the forgotten crown and return it to the royal family. The plot to Legends of Amberland is an interesting one that is quite well written and keeps you gripped throughout for most of your adventure. There are times where things slow down a bit and it takes time before the plot progresses. But those moments are seldom and there is often some lore or side quest to keep you busy, and when nearing the end things ramp up quite quickly for a satisfactory conclusion. The downfall is that dialogue is a bit sparse with characters. Very often it is just a couple of sentences unless it is an important character to do with the main plot or side quests who may have a bit more to say. The world could do with a bit more lore from the perspective of history than it has, as it seems like an interesting place with a lot to tell, but not a huge amount is spoken of. However, with that said, this is a game that has been mostly developed by one person, so great amounts of detail and lore are expected to be scarce, at least to some degree. And Legends of Amberland, while it could have more, has a reasonable amount that keeps things going. It just may not satisfy all players, so it is something to take into consideration. Aside from that, the plot does its job. It keeps things intriguing and certainly keeps you playing. Indeed, it isn't something that would satisfy the more hardcore RPG veterans who are looking for a big plot with exceeding amounts of history, backstory and lore. But for those looking for an easygoing plot that gives just enough detail and pacing to keep things interesting while they enjoy classic turn-based RPG gameplay, then Legends of Amberland's plot is sure to entertain. The gameplay to Legends of Amberland is everything you could expect from a classic party-based RPG. You have a big, mostly non-linear world to explore, full of dungeons to clear out and loot to find, along with character creation and development, quests to embark on and complete, and of course good old-fashioned turn-based combat. Let's start with the character creation and development. At the start of a playthrough you'll get the option to create your party of 7 adventurers, or you can just start the game off with a predefined party. When creating your party you get to choose each of the characters' race, gender, portrait and class. Each race and class has its advantages, disadvantages and special abilities that need to be taken into account when creating a character. For example, elves are very good magic users and are nimble, but not as strong as that of a dwarf for example. Dwarves are an excellent choice for melee characters, but they wouldn't have the quickness or magic abilities of the elves. Humans are more of an all-round style character. Each of the races also has several sub-races to choose from that can grant them additional bonuses or detriments depending on your choice and what is suitable for the character type you're looking to create. Each of the races has basic classes such as warrior, mage, cleric and bard as an example, but they also have more specialised classes too. For example, with a dwarf you can create a troll slayer. Troll slayers always deal a critical hit to that enemy type, dealing massive damage. Or with a human you can have a troubadour, which is a mix between a magic caster and a melee class. What classes and how many of a class you have in your party is entirely up to you and dependent on your playstyle. This freedom and the amount of possibilities you have with the character creation is fantastic, given plenty of combinations and different playstyles to choose from. And with all the different races and sub-races, there's lots of room to experiment with when making your perfect party of heroes. giving the gameplay some replayability. As you progress through the game defeating enemies and completing quests, your party gain experience. Once they've gained enough experience to level up, you can go to a trainer found in each castle or town to increase a party member's level individually, just like you would in the Might and Magic series. As your characters level up, they gain increases to health along with MP for magic users. Magic users also unlock new and more powerful spells upon reaching specific level milestones. Upon reaching a particular level milestone, a character will be granted a stat point that the player can place into any of the stats they see fit. Stats can also be increased by finding and purchasing different coloured vials that can be brewed by healers found in each town. Each of the different coloured vials represents a particular stat increase. While the character creation has good depth and complexity to it, the levelling up of characters is quite the opposite. I'd go as far as to say even perhaps a bit bland. There isn't much to it other than the automatic unlocking of new spells and an increase to health and MP. The only time the player has any control over the leveling of a party member is when they are granted a stat point on the odd occasion. Other than that, everything else is automatic, not giving the player much to play around with when developing their characters, at least from the perspective of leveling up. Despite its simplicity, however, the leveling up does get the job done. You do begin to notice a considerable difference in your character's power and combat abilities, but you are left with a sense that it is power gained without you having much input other than the completion of quests and slaying of monsters. A bit more complexity and player choice in how the party grows in strength would have been nice, and the lack of it won't satisfy some players. Let's move on to the exploration of the game. Legends of Amberland is a relatively non-linear game consisting of the overworld map and separate maps for dungeons, castles and the likes. You're free to explore the world as you see fit, with the only occasional restriction here and there. An example of restrictions would be requiring a boat to gain access to a particular island, where you need to complete a quest before obtaining it. Other than that, however, you're generally free to explore and go where you want. Much like with the classic games of the genre, there's plenty of monsters to defeat both in dungeons and the overworld, and plenty of places to explore. Towns act as a menu as opposed to an individual place to explore, allowing you access to shops, the inn where you can talk to patrons and sometimes pick up quests, and of course the healer and trainer. There are two different types of shops, the standard shop and the magic shop. The standard shop allows you to buy items using gold. The magic shop, however, only accepts a special currency called crystals, which can only be found in mage towers scattered throughout the land. All shops around the world have the same items for sale, but as you rescue the kidnapped craftsmen of Amberland, more and better items will become available, which is a really good and different twist. Castles you can explore and speak to the often many royal members and workers that reside in them, and dungeons include caves, temples, mages, towers, mines and so on. There's no shortage of places to go and people to speak to. While there is plenty to do and experience, the exploration isn't without its drawbacks. For starters, the overworld, while mostly non-linear, is restrictive from a difficulty standpoint. There will be the odd point where you will enter an area with enemies far stronger than your party, where you'll need to retreat and come back later after leveling up a bit, though such areas are very far and few between. There's also one point in the game where there is an imbalance with the difficulty of the monsters in a particular area, that being the Great Desert. By the time you need to cross the desert, your party is a little bit weaker than they should be to face the monsters there, resulting in you having a tough battle on your hands. But when you get through the desert, the next few areas are cakewalks in comparison, with monsters being much weaker and lower levels. Instead, the desert enemies should be easier, while the new areas bring in enemies that are more challenging than that of the desert. But that isn't the case, causing imbalance. The desert is the most challenging of all areas to get through in the whole game. Along with the imbalance, the world map isn't all that interesting from a geographical standpoint. When you look at the map, it's almost designed in the shape of a U, except with small islands sitting off the coast. You start off at the top left of the map, then you make your way down the left, then across and back up the other side. It never really branches off except for a few islands, of course. However, to make up for its bland geographical shape, there are plenty of varying environments to keep things interesting. Throughout your journey you will cross grasslands, forests, swamp, deserts, volcanic areas and snow. So while the world's shape is a bit boring, the environments help liven it up a bit and give each area its own distinctive look and feel. Another issue with the exploration is that there isn't any secrets or hidden caches in the overworld. This results in there being little reason to 100% explore the world and search its nooks and crannies, as there just isn't anything to be found. Some chests hidden away in corners and throughout various parts of the world would have been nice to make it worthwhile exploring in its entirety. At the moment there just isn't any point to it other than to say that you have explored 100% of the world. On a positive note, however, there is a fast travel system that greatly helps when exploring the world of Amberland. This fast travel mechanic isn't available at first, but early in the game you do unlock it by rescuing the master of the Griffin Transport Guild. Once unlocked, you'll be able to fast travel to any point on the map that you've previously explored, making backtracking non-existent, which is an absolute blessing. The only time that fast travel isn't available is when in combat or enemies are nearby. Other than that, you're free to fast travel anywhere you've previously been in Amberland. The exploration of Legends of Amberland is on a level that would be considered basic. which is a running trend throughout this review. It does have issues where the layout of the world could have been better, and it would have benefited from more stuff to seek out and find. It could have been far better and more interesting, but nevertheless it does the job, while the environments and unique enemies within them keeps things interesting at least to a degree. And the fast travel system results in no time consuming backtracking at all, which is fantastic. Next is the combat. Combat in Legends of Amberland is completely turn based, where your party members and your enemies will act in turn. Enemies attack based on their dexterity versus your party. The order of which your party attacks is dependent on their position in the party formation. The middle three characters will always act first out of your party members, while the two characters on each side of them will take their turn later in the round. The middle three characters are on the front line, which results in them taking the most damage dealt, along with being attacked more often than the others. The other four on the flanks generally will only get hit by area of effect attacks. The battle will end upon either you defeating the enemies, or if your party is defeated. In the circumstances where you come across an enemy that is too powerful, you can flee the battle, but only upon first entering combat, not during it. Each of the character classes also has this unique special ability that can be used once at a time. Once used, your party will have to rest before it will be possible to use it again. An example of such an ability would be Focus for mages, that allows them to restore some of their mana, or Stun, that allows a warrior to temporarily stun an enemy. But those are just two examples. Right, okay, the combat is probably sounding overly basic and simplified, but there is a bit more complexity to it than just defeating enemies with spells, weapons and class abilities. As you progress in Amberland, you will begin to come across enemies that have specific types of attack, or can inflict various ailments on your party members. Types of attacks include fire, ice, lightning and acid, while ailments include mesmerize, paralysis and fear. As you explore and find new equipment, along with unlocking new equipment to buy in the shops, certain items will grant the character that wears them resistance to attack types, lowering damage taken and immunity to particular ailments. This results in you needing to change your character equipment depending on the type of attack your enemy uses, along with their abilities that inflicts ailments. This is especially important for those on the front line who receive the most damage. Using such items to your advantage makes a big difference, and can be what determines how difficult facing certain enemies are. This is especially the case in the higher difficulty settings, so keeping an assortment of different items available to your party with various resistances and immunities is key to success with Amberland's combat. The combat of Legend of Amberland doesn't attempt to do anything new with the classic turn-based RPG formula, but it certainly replicates it exceptionally well. It's a simple enough system, but there is some complexity to it with the resistance and immunity bonuses certain equipment gives, and having to change your party's gear accordingly. For those hoping to get the classic old school combat but with modern twists will find themselves somewhat disappointed with Amberland's combat. Despite its lack of attempting to innovate, it nevertheless is a combat system that is an absolute joy to play for fans of old school RPGs. As you fight enemies, it truly feels like you're playing a game from the 90s, and that is the purpose of the game's creation, to give you that 90s experience, and it certainly succeeds with that. After all, why try to fix something that isn't already broken? The equipping of your characters with various equipment and weapons works with an encumbrance system, where your character can only wield weapons and armour up to a particular weight. If you go over that weight limit, penalties will be applied to the character, lowering their combat capabilities, especially with spellcasters. Different character classes have varying encumbrance limits, with melee classes having the higher while spellcasters being on the lower end. It is up to you what equipment your character ends up using and if it suits them. There are special belts you can find and buy that increase your character's encumbrance limit, but that comes at the cost of an accessory slot, with most character classes only having 3, so choosing who wears what is very important. The encumbrance system does add an element of tactics and complexity to the character system, as it adds a restriction on how powerful a character can become. For example, mages can't use heavier weapons, meaning while they do have melee attacks, they won't be very effective and rely on their mana and spells. While such a mechanic isn't anything new, it gets you thinking with how to best equip your characters and what weapons and armor best suits them depending on their encumbrance limit. As for the UI of the game, it is deliciously old school. Unlike other old school inspired titles that take a more modern approach to how UI is designed, Silver Lemur Games went the complete opposite, and instead embraces the design of yore. The main screen consists of the party's portraits, a minimap in the corner, and icons to different screens, and movement buttons on the mid and lower right hand side, while leaving a smallish window for the gameplay. Spells are in a list requiring the scrolling up and down, and items in your inventory while having categories also require scrolling up and down when you have a lot of items at once. The UI design works fantastically in that it gives you that old school 90s feeling while playing, and it is a joy to experience. However, if old school UI isn't to your liking, Legends of Amberland certainly isn't going to change your mind. It is very well designed, replicating the menus at the time, but with that comes the drawbacks of the UI back then too. So if old school UI design frustrates you, it certainly will here too, but otherwise you're in for a nostalgic treat. One thing that is very much worth noting with Legends of Amberland is the playtime. With a lot of games, playtime will generally be something along the lines of 25 to 30 hours, or 12 to 15 hours depending on the player's style of play. With Legends of Amberland, however, how long it takes you to complete the game fluctuates greatly from player to player. I finished the game plus all of its side quests within 13 hours. But according to the developer, players have reported taking between 22 and 38 hours to complete, with the extremities being a rarity. My 13-hour playtime is largely down to my faster playstyle, heavier reliability on fast travel, and playing the game on normal difficulty. Players who take their time with combat and exploration, and those playing on higher difficulty settings, can expect a larger amount of time. So depending on difficulty and how you play, Legends of Amberland can take anything from 13 hours right up to 38 to complete. As a whole, the gameplay to Legend of Amberland is admirably retro. The developer hasn't attempted anything new with its design, instead choosing to replicate the 90s design and bring you a whole new adventure created by them. And that's perfectly fine, and it is overall an enjoyable adventure too. There are certainly drawbacks. Such examples as this would be exploration not being as interesting or fulfilling as it could be. Character development as you progress in the game is quite bland and over basic, while the UI will suit lovers of old school gaming but not so much for those hoping for at least some modern design. Most importantly, however, the gameplay is fun and addictive, and if drawbacks and issues can be overlooked, it is a game that will keep you hooked from start to finish. But keep in mind that playtime greatly changes depending on your playstyle and difficulty setting you play the game on. Much like with how everything is designed in Legends of Amberland, the atmosphere too has a very old school 90s fantasy adventure feel to it, with an equally as retro soundtrack to go with it. Throughout the whole adventure, I felt like it was the early 90s all over again. From the visuals to the sound effects to the music, Amberland as a game and world just oozes with nostalgia in every regard. And while it doesn't offer anything new or exciting from its atmosphere, it nevertheless brings you down childhood lane in a manner that very few other retro inspired games can. That alone makes it worth the trip. Legends of Amberland, despite its issues at times, has nevertheless been a very enjoyable experience. The developer hasn't attempted to innovate with Legends of Amberland, and that is something that, while maybe seen as a drawback, also works in the game's favour. Because of the lack of innovation, Legends of Amberland has a much stronger sense of nostalgia to it, bringing you on a much more powerful trip down memory lane of childhood gaming than one that does attempt to innovate. Throughout the whole game, I felt like a kid again, playing RPGs in the 90s, and that is a wonderful thing to experience, especially with everything going on in the world at the moment. But one of the big things I've seen people mention with Legends of Amberland is whether it is worth its price or not. And in truth, there's no real straightforward way of answering that, as with Amberland it is just so subjective as to whether or not one would think it is or isn't. From the perspective of depth, it may be a bit expensive for some, but it depends on what you're looking for. If you're seeking a very faithful take on old school turn-based RPGs, then yes, you'll probably see it worth it. If you're looking for more than that, the chances are you will be somewhat disappointed with what you get for the price. From the perspective of playtime, that vastly changes from person to person, and depends greatly on how you play. But expect anything from 13 to 20 hours minimum, and if you feel that's a good amount of playtime for your money, go for it. Indeed, it isn't a game for everyone. Only those looking to experience old school gaming and those who are truly enamoured by it and how games played and were designed back in the 90s will get the most enjoyment out of Legends of Amberland. Those looking for a nostalgia trip with modern twists, however, won't find that here. Legends of Amberland doesn't try anything new, and it certainly has its shortcomings in some regards, but as a whole, it is an enjoyable and addictive game that gives you that true 90s RPG experience that once you pick it up, you will find hard to put down. And with that, I give Legends of Amberland a 7 out of 10. Legends of Amberland is a perfect example where a game doesn't always have to do something new for it to be enjoyable. Sometimes giving players a very faithful replica of a type of game from years long gone is all that you need. Silver Lemur Game set out to bring gamers the old school Might and Magic experience with their game, and they certainly succeeded in that. And with so few on the market, there was no better time for them to do it. If you love old school RPGs like Wizardry and Might and Magic and all the old design that came with them, give this one a go. It'll bring you on one hell of a trip down memory lane.